Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we want you to think back a little, not just to your high school history class, but to the feeling of being in that class. Do you remember the weight of that textbook? The sheer density of all the names and dates, and that feeling that history was already decided, predictable, and frankly, kind of boring.
That is such a universal experience, and it's a crucial signal, actually, that boredom, that complete lack of suspense. It's the direct result of a calculated process.
A calculated process.
Yeah, we're diving into a stack of sources today that argue American history, at least the way it's packaged in textbooks, functions less as an honest account of our past and more as a powerful tool for national myth-making.
So a sanitized version?
Completely. It's riddled with distortions, omissions, and what really amounts to fabrication.
Okay, let's unpack that. Our mission today is to give you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed, which I guess means we have to dismantle that foundational story we all learned.
That's the goal. We have to identify the structural biases that shape how millions of students understand their government, their heroes, and really their own place in the world.
And the sources are pretty blunt about this. They say textbooks just dominate history education, and they tell these incredibly predictable stories.
They do. They consciously exclude any real conflict or suspense because they have this obligation to present a narrative of perpetual American success.
Yeah.
Everything has to reinforce our national character.
And if you take out the conflict and the real struggle.
So you take out the drama, and what you're left with is just a morality play.
So the goal isn't historical accuracy. It's more like civic instruction, based on this kind of bland optimism. The message is just be a good citizen, respect your heritage, it all works out.
Exactly. But that narrative, this focus on relentless progress and individual merit, it actually creates this deep alienation for a huge part of the audience.
Oh, so
Well, think about students whose families have faced systemic barriers. Children of color, working class kids, anyone who sees firsthand that the American dream doesn't always happen just through hard work.
right.
So when the textbook only offers success and optimism, any experience of failure or struggle it's implicitly blamed on the individual.
Not on any structural issues in society.
Exactly. And that prevents any deep, critical understanding of how the world actually works.
And the way the history is delivered, it just seals that alienation. Students are kept away from the raw, messy materials of history, the actual speeches, the diaries, the protest songs.
Yes. Instead, they get the editor's voice, this omniscient narrator, just telling them what to think. When history is just a set of pre-approved facts, it stops being a living, engaging subject.
The sources say it should be what was the phrase? A furious debate.
A furious debate informed by evidence and reason. But textbook authors, they want clarity and consensus, so they just remove the debate. One group of authors even said they have tried to offer reasoned judgments on issues.
So they don't show you the controversy.
They just hand down the verdict.
And what does that do to a student when history is presented with that kind of, godlike certainty?
It paralyzes them. One student who was interviewed said they never thought to question what was presented because, quote, everything was presented as if it were the full picture.
And if most Americans never take history beyond high school?
Then that foundational understanding they get is rigid and brittle. It trains them for acquiescence, not critical engagement. It makes them, frankly, ill-equipped to be citizens.
That structural framework, this need to reassure and sanitize, that brings us right to the content itself. Let's start with how they build the heroes who are supposed to embody this national character.
We need to define a term the sources use here. It's called heroification.
Heroification. That word alone sounds destructive. What does it mean?
The authors call it a degenerative process, much like calcification. It's a pretty gruesome analogy, right? It means turning these complex, flesh and blood people, individuals with real conflicts, pain, and human interest, into these pious, perfect creatures. They lose all their credibility because they're made inhumanly flawless.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, complexity is interesting. Perfection is just boring. And this happens to everyone, right? Not just presidents.
Right. Let's look at the incredible case study of Helen Keller.
Okay, everyone knows Helen Keller.
Everyone knows her. She's in the national pantheon. She is the absolute epitome of the inspirational story, the woman who overcame being blind and deaf. That's the part we all get.
But what do students actually learn about what she did after she learned to communicate?
Almost nothing. She's just a symbol, an anecdote about perseverance, not a real actor in history.
So what are they leaving out?
Textbooks systematically omit the last 64 years of her life.
64 years.
Yeah. They treat her like a myth whose story just ends the moment she masters language. What they leave out is her radical social philosophy. Keller became a staunch, vocal, and often provocative socialist
A socialist.
and a co-founder of the ACLU. She spent her entire adult life fighting for workers' rights, for women's suffrage, against militarism.
A co-founder of the ACLU.
Yeah.
I mean, that is critical biographical information. It completely changes who she was, and it's just redacted from the books meant to teach us about our heroes.
It's a deliberate choice. It leaves students with a moral lesson, be inspired, but with zero content about why she chose to live her life that way.
And her own words on this are pretty ironic.
Extremely. She once said, "People do not like to think. If one thinks, one must reach conclusions. Conclusions are not always pleasant." Well, the textbooks make sure students are never exposed to the unpleasant conclusion that their national hero was a radical socialist.
Because that would complicate the narrative. Her actual political life shows that heroes can hold views, like socialism, that are, quote, repugnant to the establishment.
And that confrontation with complexity is exactly what publishers want to avoid. This heroification, it gets even more pronounced with political leaders. Take Woodrow Wilson.
Ah, Wilson, the great progressive reformer, architect of the League of Nations.
That's how he's presented. He gets extensive positive coverage, but so much of his actual record is obscured through what is basically historical airbrushing.
The sources point to two major areas of his anti-democratic policy that are often missing: his racial policies and his military interventions. Let's start with race.
Wilson was a Southerner, a former professor, and an outspoken white supremacist. The sources note he would openly tell racist stories in his own cabinet meetings.
Seriously?
And as soon as he took office, he used his executive power to reverse decades of precedent. He systematically segregated the federal government. Black and white employees were forced to work and eat separately.
That is a staggering step backward. Why was that so significant?
Well, for decades, even under Republican administrations, African Americans had held important and powerful federal offices, especially in the South. Wilson came in and swiftly feared them, or pushed them out, replacing them with Southern whites. His actions effectively slammed the door of the Democratic Party on African Americans for another 20 years.
And this wasn't just domestic policy. He worked against racial equality on the world stage, too.
Yes, this is crucial. During the negotiation of the League of Nations Covenant at Versailles, Japan proposed a clause that would affirm racial equality.
And Wilson.
He personally vetoed it. He made sure that this major new international body would not recognize racial equality, which helped maintain the status quo of white global dominance. It's a critical moment, and textbooks often just omit it, or they minimize his personal role.
Then there's the really troubling connection to the film The Birth of a Nation. This is one of those facts that's almost too shocking to believe.
It is a profound moral failure, and it's almost always omitted. The film, which was originally called The Klansman, was just notoriously racist. It glorified the Ku Klux Klan, pushed the idea that Reconstruction failed because black people were incapable of self-rule.
And Wilson saw it.
He held a private screening in the White House. The book was written by a former classmate of his, and after seeing it, he publicly complimented it. He said, and this is a direct quote, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so true."
Writing history with lightning. I mean, that's an endorsement of staggering power, especially from the president.
It absolutely was. It encouraged the reestablishment of the Ku Klux Klan, which then grew exponentially in the 1920s, dominating not just the South, but states like Indiana and Oregon.
And how do textbooks handle that, if at all?
They can't reconcile the image of the progressive intellectual with the overt white supremacist, so they gloss over it. Or, in one unbelievable case the sources cite, they try to excuse it by saying, Wilson seemed to agree with most white Americans that segregation was in the best interests of black as well as white Americans.
Which is just the definition of minimizing structural racism. Okay, let's move beyond race to his foreign interventions, particularly in Latin America. These were not altruistic.
Not at all. Wilson intervened militarily multiple times in the Caribbean and Central America, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua. And with hindsight, we know these interventions were disastrous. They set the stage for decades of brutal dictatorships.
Batista in Cuba, the Duvaliers in Haiti.
Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, the Somozas in Nicaragua. These dictators often rose directly from the military structures the U.S. Marines left behind.
And the textbooks, they obscure Wilson's role in this through some clever grammar, right? The passive voice.
Precisely. They might say that forces were ordered to withdraw at some point, implying the U.S. was leaving a messy situation. But if you look closely, they often fail to specify who ordered the forces in to begin with.
So it just happened.
It just happened. In Haiti, for instance, the Marines
Yeah.
invaded in 1915, forced the legislature to pick our preferred candidate as president. And then, when the Haitians refused to declare war on Germany in World War I, the U.S. just dissolved their legislature entirely.
And half the textbooks don't even mention this takeover. That's a total erasure of colonialism.
It is. It obscures the fact that Wilson applied self-determination very selectively. It was fine for Belgium, maybe, but not for the unruly nations of Latin America. The textbooks simply can't show the U.S. acting as a self-interested colonial power. It contradicts the heroic state narrative.
And finally, on Wilson, we can't ignore his attacks on civil liberties at home during World War I, the Espionage and Sedition Acts.
This period is crucial. It shows the chilling effect of patriotism. Wilson pushed to strengthen the Espionage Act, giving the president broad censorship powers. His postmaster general, with his full approval, suppressed mail that was deemed socialist or anti-British or even pro-Irish.
It became dangerous just to oppose the war.
It did. The government's propaganda arm, the Creel Committee, even urged Americans to report the man who cries for peace.
That is a profound move toward authoritarianism.
It is. The sources argue that during this time, the U.S. came closer to being a police state than ever before or since. But if textbooks showed Wilson actively suppressing dissent, violating free speech, promoting segregation, well, the image of the wise progressive leader just crumbles.
So the justification for leaving all this out, the racism, the censorship, the colonialism, Helen Keller socialism, it's this feeling of coercion, this need to speak respectfully about the past to pass on our heritage.
It's a kind of historical etiquette, but it's destructive. Publishers and authors idolize these people, reducing them to melodramatic stick figures. We're trading credibility for comfort. And in the end, students just grow cynical about these establishment heroes because they're presented as completely unreal.
Okay, so if the sanitizing of established figures shows how history is made safe, let's go back to the very beginning. Chapter 1 of The American Story, which shows us how heroes are manufactured from the ground up. Christopher Columbus. We're moving into Section 2, looking at how the 1492 myth was constructed.
Right, 1492. It's one of the few dates every school child remembers, and every single textbook includes it. But they omit or actively distort virtually everything important about his voyages.
And it's all in service of
What? Of establishing him as the singular, heroic founder of America.
The first distortion, the one that just refuses to die, is the flat earth fiction.
This is the durable myth. That Columbus was this man of science, arguing bravely against superstitious flat earth primitives. This fable wasn't even part of the original history. It was popularized much later in 1828 by Washington Irving in his biography of Columbus.
He just made it up.
He needed dramatic flourish. So he invented the opposition. In reality, most educated people on both sides of the Atlantic in 1492 knew the world was round. The debate was just about its circumference.
So the myth sticks around because it serves that narrative. It makes Columbus the forward-thinking hero who corrected our bad geography.
And it implies European thought was crude until he came along. This heroic archetype is then reinforced by how they portray his crew. The sailors are always stupid, superstitious, and cowardly, terrified of sailing off the edge.
In sharp contrast to the brave, godly Columbus, what's the underlying message there?
It's an anti-working class, pro-boss polemic. It subtly reinforces the idea that leaders, the bosses, are inherently more intelligent and morally superior to the laborers who, actually rowed the boats.
That's a fascinating layer of class bias right at the origin. But the biggest bias in the Columbus story, the one that props up Eurocentrism, is the omission that he was nowhere near the first non-Indigenous person to reach the Americas.
This is where the historical filtering is just so transparent. 7 of the 12 textbooks, at least, mention the Norse voyages. We know the Norse had a colony in Greenland that lasted for 500 years. They reached Newfoundland, where Thorfinn Karlsefni led a settlement party around 1005.
But the textbooks downplay this, right?
Oh, absolutely. They minimize these long-term settlements, calling it merely touching the shore briefly, suggesting it was irrelevant. But when you look at the non-European predecessors, the bias becomes even clearer, because that evidence is just totally ignored.
We're talking about evidence of African or Afro-Phoenician voyages before 1492. What does the material actually show?
The sources point to several pieces of evidence. Crucially, there's the discovery of spear points in Haiti made of something called guanine. It's an alloy of gold, silver, and copper. Now, here's the fascinating part. The composition of this alloy is identical to that used by West Africans. It's definitive physical evidence of pre-Columbian contact.
An identical composition, that's a smoking gun.
It really is. It speaks directly to manufacturing provenance. It's not just a similar metal, it's the exact same metallurgical signature from a specific culture. And Columbus himself found these in 1492. If this was included, it would suggest West Africans not only made contact, but maybe even had trade relationships.
And there are other sources, too.
Yes. Islamic historical accounts record voyages west from the Mali Empire around 1311. And then there's the controversial but often cited evidence of the Olmec colossal heads in Mexico,
Which are described as
amazingly Negroid by anthropologists.
Yeah.
Now, the origin of the Olmecs is a complex debate, but the sheer weight of all this, the metallurgy, the historical records, the artifacts, it all points to non-European contact. And the textbooks ignore all of it.
And yet, in stunning contrast, 5 of the textbooks include the very dubious Irish legends of St. Brendan's voyage.
With tales of landing on a whale's back. It's the perfect illustration of Eurocentric bias. They'll include completely unsupported legends as long as they trace back to Europe, but they omit solid physical and historical evidence if it challenges European primacy.
Let's pivot to the moral consequence of all this heroification. The reality of 1493 and beyond. Textbooks praise Columbus's navigation skills, but they leave out the purpose of his second voyage.
Which was conquest and subjugation. The second voyage was an armada, it was heavily armed, and his purpose was explicitly to dominate and exploit. The accounts from people like Barcolin and de Las Casas, they detail horrific brutality, use of war dogs to tear indigenous people apart, the forced labor that quickly became genocide.
We have to mention the demographic collapse figures here. They are essential to understanding the scale of this.
On Hispaniola, where Columbus first landed, some estimates put the pre-Columbian population as high as 8 million. Columbus started a brutal slave trade and forced labor system. A census of Indian adults in 1496 found 1.1 million survivors.
Here by 1516.
Only 12,000 remained. By 1555, the native Arawak population was extinct. This is not a tragic misunderstanding. It is a calculated genocide driven by greed, and omitting this shields students from the terrible truth of early colonialism.
Beyond the human cost, the wealth Columbus brought back transformed the global economy. How did American riches change Europe?
The gold and silver from the Americas, it was the catalyst for Europe's economic revolution. This flood of precious metals caused a massive, sustained 400% inflation across Europe. This fundamentally changed the nature of wealth, allowing Europe to develop a global market system based on fluid capital.
And this had a profound and often ignored consequence for Africa and the slave trade.
This is a critical link that's usually lost. For centuries, the trans-Saharan trade routes had supplied gold and silver to the Old World, which gave African traders huge economic power. But once the Americas began flooding the market with gold,
the African gold traders lost their most valuable commodity.
Exactly. They were left with only one commodity that Europe still aggressively wanted: slaves. As the anthropologist Jack Weatherford put it, Africans became victims of the discovery of America as surely as did the American Indians.
So Columbus's legacy is complicated.
He was a heroic navigator, no doubt, but also a great plunderer. And by only presenting the first part, textbooks implicitly ask students to endorse colonialism and violence.
So we've established how the first American hero was manufactured. Let's move forward now into Section 3 and look at the next great origin story we're all taught: the myth of the Pilgrims.
This myth hinges on a single idea: that Europeans arrived on a virgin continent, a vast empty wilderness just waiting for them. The sources argue this isn't just an inaccuracy, it's a required lie.
A lie that whitewashes what?
One of the greatest, darkest forces in American history: disease.
The military and social tech of Europeans allowed for conquest, but the sources argue that the catastrophic plagues that swept through the Americas before the Pilgrims, that was the prerequisite for settlement.
The demographic numbers are just staggering. William McNeill estimates the population of the Americas in 1492 was around 100 million people. The earliest epidemics, they ran ahead of the settlers, decimating those populations.
So the continent wasn't a virgin continent.
The sources call it a recently widowed land, stripped of most of its inhabitants by European diseases, often years before settlers even arrived. The plague is, arguably, the most important precondition for the survival of the early British settlements.
And the settlers knew this was happening.
Oh, yes. They were quite aware of the wonderful plague that was clearing the way for them. Furthermore, when the Mayflower arrived, the idea that they were all a group of religious zealots is just false. Only 35 of the 102 settlers were actual pilgrims. The rest were just regular folks looking for economic opportunity in Virginia.
And there's evidence the Pilgrims basically intended to hijack the voyage to get to Massachusetts, far from Anglican control.
Yes, and this is all compounded by the core lie of the errand into the wilderness story. The site they chose for their settlement, New Plymouth, it wasn't a wilderness outpost. It was Squanto's recently depopulated village of Patuxent.
They chose it because it was already cleared.
Exactly. They chose it for its beautiful cleared fields recently planted in corn. They avoided the backbreaking labor of clearing the land by just appropriating cleared Indian cornfields.
So the very act of creating the settlement was an act of appropriation, not some pioneering struggle.
And that fact, which undermines the whole hard work myth, is systematically omitted.
Which brings us right to Thanksgiving, the national origin myth we reenact every single fall. And the modern holiday isn't even really a pilgrim tradition.
Not at all. The modern holiday was proclaimed by Lincoln in 1863 during the Civil War. The Pilgrims weren't connected to the tradition until the 1890s. The celebration essentially reinforces an ethnocentrism, framing it as God on our side, wresting civilization from the savage wilderness.
And the specific details of the feast, they get inverted.
Yes, to serve a non-benign purpose. Textbooks and school materials constantly push the idea that we, the advanced white people, provided for the Indians. The classic example is the notion that Pilgrims taught the Indians how to plant corn with fish fertilizer.
When it was the other way around.
Completely. Every single food mentioned at that feast, corn, squash, turkey, it was all indigenous to the Americas. The idea that we provide for the Indians is this pervasive theme, just like the false claim that plantation owners provided food and care for their slaves, ignoring that black labor paid for everything.
And this suppression of the truth, it goes beyond textbooks. There was an incident with a Wampanoag speaker, Frank James, in 1970.
Yes. James, a Wampanoag, was chosen to speak at the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' Landing. He planned to give a historically accurate speech detailing how, just 4 days after the Mayflower landed, the Pilgrims robbed the graves of his ancestors and stole their winter food supplies.
He was going to talk about enslavement and disease.
Yes, and the Massachusetts Department of Commerce blocked his speech entirely.
What?
They censored him not because his claims were false, but because they were historical truths that contradicted the happy story they wanted to tell. The state agency told him his speech was incendiary. Textbooks follow that same model. They omit grave robbing and enslavement and instead supply feel-good minutia about Squanto. It's not about perspective. It's about reinforcing a conflict-free civil religion.
We've seen the sanitizing of heroes and origin stories. Now we're moving into Section 4, which deals with what the sources call the most persistent and damaging erasures in American history, the invisibility of race, class, and the nature of the state itself.
This section really confronts the central division in American life. The prevailing theme that underlies our history, as the material argues, is the domination of Black America by white America. And textbooks just struggle profoundly to address that truthfully.
And to really grapple with slavery's legacy, you have to connect it to its twin legacies: socioeconomic inferiority for Black people and cultural racism for white people.
And that requires understanding how unique European slavery was. Unlike earlier forms of slavery, which were often temporary or based on debt, the European system became inherently racialized. The enslavement of other Europeans became illegitimate, but the enslavement of Africans became acceptable.
Justified by this new rationale of cultural racism.
Exactly. And that created this core cultural belief that it's just appropriate for whites to be at the top and blacks to be at the bottom, embedding racism into the very structure of American opportunity.
But textbooks often minimize this, especially when discussing our heroes like the Founding Fathers.
They just can't bear to tarnish the bronze statue. Thomas Jefferson is the prime example. He owned hundreds of slaves, yet textbooks will use this ambiguous phrasing like Jefferson and others who owned slaves were troubled by it. They censor his truly explicit white supremacist statements.
Including what he wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia.
Exactly. In that work, Jefferson lays out his fears about racial mixing and equality. And he concludes with this lurid prediction that if equality were attempted, the endeavor will probably never end but in the extermination of the one or the other race.
An endorsement of white supremacy and potential ethnic cleansing.
And that quote is just systematically removed from the history books to maintain the myth of Jefferson as this uniformly enlightened figure.
This sanitization continues into the post-Civil War period with Reconstruction. And for decades, Textbooks basically perpetuated white supremacist propaganda.
That's right. Between about 1890 and the 1960s, textbooks presented the Confederate myth of Reconstruction. They portrayed the period as one of corrupt Republican rule and incompetent black-dominated legislatures that supposedly ruined the South.
And that historical lie was incredibly damaging.
Profoundly. A young African-American reading that was taught that their race messed up history when given a chance, which just reinforces the white supremacist idea that whites should always be in control.
When, in reality, states like Mississippi had less corrupt governments during Reconstruction than in the decades that followed.
Precisely. And after Reconstruction, we get the period known as the nadir, from about 1890 to 1920, which was marked by escalating racial violence. This was the era of lynchings, mass attacks on black communities, and the rise of sundown towns.
And textbooks tend to frame this as a purely Southern problem.
Which is critical.
Yeah.
Most students have no idea that in many northern areas, segregation in housing, jobs, and social services was widespread and deeply institutionalized until well after World War II. Framing racism as a Southern problem lets the North off the hook.
Okay, let's move to Section B, the denial of social class. If race is the deepest division, class is arguably the most fundamental structural force, and yet it's almost invisible in these books.
The omission is stunning. Our sources note that 6 of the 12 textbooks they surveyed have no index listing at all for terms like social class, income distribution, or inequality.
None at all.
None. Textbooks prefer to assure students that America is just a middle-class country. They focus on individual effort and upward mobility. They might mention the growth of suburbs, but talking about the middle class just mutes any discussion of class differences.
So what's the consequence for a student when class is just erased from history?
The focus on meritocracy, the idea that everyone gets what they deserve, it results in what sociologists call the hidden injuries of class.
Meaning what?
Meaning if a working class student is struggling or sees their parents struggling despite hard labor, and the books say opportunity is equal, they internalize the idea that their lower status is their own fault.
They don't have the language to understand that social structures push people around.
Exactly. And that internalization of blame is incredibly damaging. It discourages political thought. And the reason for the erasure is, again, fear and censorship. Publishers openly fear class analysis. One editor said, "You always run the risk, if you talk about social class, of being labeled Marxist."
So pressure from conservative adoption boards in big states like Texas, it forces publishers to just eliminate the topic to make sure they get sales.
It's the ultimate example of market pressures dictating historical truth.
Which brings us to Section C, the heroic state and foreign policy. If we can't criticize our heroes or our economic structure, we certainly can't criticize the government itself.
Right. Textbooks portray the federal government as inherently benevolent, a heroic entity without blemishes. They function as antecedentship manuals because they encourage blind trust, not critical dissent.
Let's contrast the textbook portrayal of U.S. motives, all humanitarian ideals, with the shocking frankness of George Kennan's 1948 memo.
Kennan was a major architect of post-war U.S. foreign policy, and he wrote explicitly about our rationale. He said, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real test is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity."
Wow. I mean, you can't get more explicit than maintain this position of disparity.
He then explicitly stated that we cannot afford the luxury of altruism and world benefaction unreal objectives such as human rights. This is the brutal, cold reality of foreign policy, but textbooks ignore it. Instead, they focus on symbolic, negligible programs like the Peace Corps.
So they substitute a small altruistic program for the huge influence of, say, multinational corporations and military operations.
Exactly. They ignore ITT destabilizing Chile and instead present our foreign policy as a series of rational humanitarian responses. They refuse to look below the surface of the government's own explanations.
And that leads to ignoring significant government misconduct abroad, the list of unmentionables.
The material points out a series of critical covert actions that are systematically omitted. Overthrowing the democratically elected government in Iran in 1953 to bring back the Shah, involvement in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in Zaire in 1961, and repeated active attempts to murder Fidel Castro.
And if students don't know, the U.S. helped install a police state in Iran in 1953.
They have no basis for understanding why Iranians might have been so angry with the U.S. government that they took hostages in 1979. Textbooks just don't let on about what our government has done.
This pattern continues at home, too. Let's talk about the FBI during the Civil Rights Movement.
Textbooks often take the Hollywood approach, crediting the federal government for all the advances. They focus on benevolent white federal agents. They actively omit the fact that the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was often an enemy of the movement.
What specific actions did they take?
The FBI engaged in active surveillance and tried to neutralize Martin Luther King Jr., who Hoover thought was a communist threat. More chillingly, the FBI flatly refused to protect civil rights workers in Mississippi, even when they faced death threats, saying it wasn't their job.
And one of the most egregious cases happened during the Orangeburg Massacre in 1968.
Yes. When state troopers shot 31 black student demonstrators in South Carolina, the FBI actually falsified information about the students to help the troopers with their defense.
That's critical misconduct.
It is. And textbooks omit it entirely. They'll even reverse the time order to suggest that government action motivated the civil rights movement, rather than the movement forcing the government to act.
Because they believe loyalty to the government can only be maintained if students think the state has never done anything wrong, it confirms the thesis. They are anti-citizenship manuals. That sets the stage perfectly for our final content section, which deals with the events that should be the most relevant to students today, yet are the most aggressively ignored. This is the theft of the recent past, which the material calls the Sasha.
Right. Historians distinguish between the distant past, the Zamani, which is stable and agreed upon, and the recent past, the Sasha, which is still turbulent, controversial, and living. The problem is that textbooks dedicate dramatically fewer pages to the Sasha.
We're talking about giving fewer than 35 pages to the entire 1960s, a decade that included the Civil Rights Movement, most of the Vietnam War, major assassinations.
It's Disney World history, a compressed, bland account driven by the need to avoid controversy. And this lack of coverage is compounded by the fact that they omit the primary source materials that actually shaped how the public understood events like Vietnam. That war was defined by iconic, history-shaping images.
Let's list those crucial images, the ones young people today who only know the war from movies are deprived of.
We have to start with the Buddhist monk, Quan Duc, sitting impassively in a Saigon intersection and immolating himself.
The little girl, Phanthi Kim Phuc, running naked from a napalm attack.
The image of the national police chief executing a terrified man with a pistol shot in the street.
And the photos from the My Lai massacre.
The bodies in the ditch. And the desperate helicopter evacuation from the Saigon rooftop.
These weren't just illustrations, they were events in themselves. They literally changed public opinion about the war.
They are indispensable primary sources. And textbooks omit them because they depict atrocities or profound moral failings by our side or our allies. The execution photo helped persuade Americans their side wasn't morally superior. My Lai showed that American troops could commit war crimes.
In silencing the dissenters, that makes the anti-war movement incomprehensible. Students only hear the arguments from Johnson and Nixon, so the opposition just seems chaotic or unpatriotic.
They exclude the key quotes that crystallize the opposition. None of the textbooks include Muhammad Ali's powerful statement, "No Viet Cong ever called me nigger."
Or the famous chilling quote from the officer at Bentray.
It became necessary to destroy the town to save it. The dissent is erased, leaving the government's rationalizations as the only voice students hear.
So, if the Sasha, the turbulent recent past, is stolen, what is the ultimate cost of this historical timidity?
The cost is perspective and civic competency. If students don't know the lessons of Vietnam, they are profoundly ill-equipped when politicians debate intervening in Angola or Lebanon or Bosnia. They lack the historical analogs to apply to current events.
The bumper stickers from the 80s, El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam, that only worked because people knew the history.
Exactly. When history is taught this way, students take away very little that they can apply to the world they enter at graduation. A world still marked by social inequality, persistent racism, and endless international conflicts. The theft of the Sasha is, in the material's words, the most wicked crime schools perpetrate on high school students.
We have covered a colossal amount of ground, from the flat earth fiction to the FBI's surveillance of Martin Luther King Jr. Let's conclude now with Section 5 and reflect on the consequences of all this and the central optimistic philosophy that underpins it all.
At the root of all these omissions is what the sources call the archetype of progress. Textbooks are marked by an incurable optimism. They promote American exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. is the most moral, most successful country in the world, and that things are always getting better.
A kind of chronological ethnocentrism.
Exactly. We judge our accomplishments against a simplified past, assuming our society is objectively ahead of all others.
And that leads to some dangerous assumptions.
It does. If you apply some simple, uncomfortable math, this optimism just crumbles. If the U.S. economy keeps growing at, say, 3%, the economy doubles every quarter century. That means our consumption of energy and raw materials also doubles every quarter century.
And the average American already consumes the same resources as 10 average world citizens.
So if that's the current reality, our continued economic leadership is not something other nations can or should replicate. The planet literally cannot support it.
That is the hard truth that optimism blinds us to.
Economically and ecologically, the U.S. is the bane, not the hope of the world. Our continued expansion makes it structurally less likely that less developed nations can expand theirs. Yet, textbooks continue to promote the idea that America remains the last best hope of Earth.
Which makes it impossible for students to think critically about environmental limits or the planetary commons.
Right. So the ultimate underlying goal of this sanitized history isn't actually to teach truth. It's to serve a political purpose.
As the philosopher Martin Heidegger suggested, history is often taught not to teach truth, but to make a people certain, clear, and strong.
Textbooks aim to create allegiance by presenting a nation without repression or conflict. But an allegiance built on omission, it prevents true idealism and critical thought.
And the knowledge of the awkward, difficult truth, that our heroes were deeply flawed, that the government targeted its own citizens, that is what's necessary for freedom and civic competency.
We have to recognize that history is inevitably partial. The solution isn't to just replace Eurocentric lies with, say, Afrocentric lies. The solution is to encourage critical inquiry itself. Students must be trained to apply what we could call a sociology of knowledge approach whenever they encounter historical material.
So we train them to constantly ask 3 questions.
Exactly. Why was this written? Whose viewpoint is presented? And whose is omitted? And what interest does this specific statement serve?
That is the ultimate takeaway. History shouldn't be about memorizing dead facts, but about engaging in that furious debate informed by evidence and reason.
Precisely. If we begin to question the motives and omissions of the sources we consume, we move closer to the realization in that old spiritual that speaks to the core of American freedom. The truth shall make us free someday.
A truly challenging and necessary perspective to gain today. Thank you for guiding us through this essential deconstruction on the deep dive.